Picture the scene that's been repeated in documentary after documentary, on museum placards, in older academic papers written before 2018. Steppe warriors on horse-drawn chariots, thundering down out of the grasslands into Anatolia around 2000 BCE, conquering the people already living there and imposing their language on the wreckage. That's the Hittite origin story most people have absorbed without ever questioning it. It's clean, it's dramatic, and it fits neatly into the bigger legend of Indo-European conquest sweeping across Eurasia. It's also, according to the actual bones, wrong. Between 2018 and 2022, 3 major ancient DNA papers checked this invasion story against real skeletal evidence, and it fell apart. Not because scientists found a different migration to replace it with, but because the migration itself was never there to begin with. The scale of the checking matters here. The Southern Ark project alone, published by Lazaridis and his team in Science in 2022, sequenced 727 ancient individuals to test exactly this kind of question. And there's a second problem sitting underneath the first one, a problem most viral headlines skip entirely. Even the phrase Hittite DNA itself turns out to be doing more work than it should. Much of what gets labeled that way in the press may not be Hittite at all. So if the Hittites didn't ride in from the steppe, where did they actually come from, and whose bones are scientists even looking at? If you're the type who wants the actual paper behind the headline instead of the recycled myth, hit subscribe. That's basically the whole channel. What's about to get dismantled here isn't a new discovery replacing an old one. It's an absence, a total lack of signal where an invasion should have left one, in a dataset large enough that it couldn't have been missed by accident. Before any of that, though, the story has to start where the mystery itself started, not in a lab but on a clay tablet. Start with the language, because that's the piece that made archaeologists suspicious in the first place, decades before anyone had the technology to test a single fragment of ancient bone. The Hittites left something most Bronze Age peoples didn't: their own writing, in their own words, on their own terms. Cuneiform tablets recovered from Hattusa reveal a language that is unmistakably Indo-European, a member of the same family tree as Latin, as Sanskrit, as Greek, as the English being spoken right now. That alone should have been unremarkable. Indo-European languages turn up across a huge stretch of Eurasia. What made Hittite strange was how it looked next to its relatives. According to Discover magazine's 2025 coverage of the Lazaridis findings, Hittite preserves some of the most archaic grammatical features found in any attested Indo-European language. It reads, in places, like an older layer of the family than languages spoken 1,000 years later elsewhere. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. Indo-European languages were assumed to have spread outward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, carried by the Yamnaya culture on their expansions into Europe and Asia. If that was the mechanism everywhere else, it seemed reasonable to assume Hittite speakers had ridden in on the same wave. Except there was a problem nobody could quite resolve. Prior to 2022, the entire Anatolian branch of Indo-European, Hittite, Luwian, Palaic, was the one branch that had never been proven to carry any steppe ancestry at all. Every other daughter language across Europe and Central Asia came with at least some genetic paper trail back to the steppe. Anatolian didn't. Hattusa itself, the Hittite capital where those tablets were unearthed, sits in north-central Anatolia, in what is today Boğazkale, Turkey, and there's a strange silence surrounding it. Hittite writing is attested by roughly 1800 BCE, but there's no trace of an Indo-European presence, not even in personal names, in the neighboring Egyptian, Semitic, or Sumerian records for roughly 1,650 years before that. Civilizations that were literate, engaged in wide-ranging trade, recording foreign names constantly, and yet nothing Indo-European shows up in their archives until Hittite simply appears, fully formed, at Hattusa. That silence is exactly why geneticists went looking for bones instead of tablets. The 2022 Southern Ark study, led by Lazaridis and published in Science, sequenced ancient DNA from Anatolia and its surrounding neighbors across a span of roughly 10,000 years. It was built, in part, to finally settle what centuries of philology couldn't. The central result is stated plainly in the paper itself. Negligible impact from Yamnaya-related steppe migration on Bronze Age Anatolia. Not reduced impact, not partial impact, negligible. Instead, the data points somewhere else entirely. Both the Bronze Age population of Anatolia and the Yamnaya on the steppe trace back to a shared, older ancestral pool centered in the highlands around the Caucasus Mountains. These aren't two populations where one invaded the other. They're cousins, descended from a common source population that split apart much earlier and then spread outward in two different directions. The paper's own language leaves little room for reinterpretation. Anatolia, it states, was reshaped by intra-West Asian gene flow, movement and mixing within West Asia itself, not by a later wave arriving from the steppe. The implication reaches well beyond the Hittites specifically. It flips the entire homeland debate for Indo-European as a whole. If Hittite never needed a steppe migration to explain its presence in Anatolia, then the search for where Indo-European actually began gets pulled south, out of the grasslands and into West Asia. The Caucasus, not the steppe, is where this story actually starts. Follow that thread up into the highlands themselves, into what's now Armenia, eastern Turkey, and northern Iran, because this is the region the Southern Arc team points to as the shared root behind everything just laid out. Geneticists have a name for the ancestry component that traces back here: CHG, Caucasus hunter-gatherer. It's one of the deepest, most consistently detected signals in ancient West Asian genomes. Alongside it sits a related cline researchers call CLV, short for Caucasus Lower Volga, which links Caucasus Neolithic populations directly to groups occupying the Lower Volga steppe further north. The numbers on that cline are specific. CLV-derived ancestry contributed roughly 4/5 of the total ancestry found in the Yamnaya themselves. That's the majority of what made the Yamnaya genetically who they were. And the same CLV-related stream contributed at least 1/10 of the ancestry found in Bronze Age Central Anatolians, the exact population among whom Hittite was spoken centuries later. This isn't a single migratory event pointed in either direction. It's a slow diffusion radiating outward from one highland zone, moving north onto the open steppe on one side and south into the Anatolian plateau on the other, over a long stretch of time. Which means the two camps that spent decades arguing over separate homelands, the steppe camp and the Anatolian camp, were, without realizing it, arguing over two different endpoints of the exact same source population. The reception to this reading says something too. Christian Christensen, one of the steppe hypothesis's own longtime defenders, has already gone on record calling this interpretation convincing. That kind of agreement, coming from inside the camp that had the most to lose from it, is worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward, because this result wasn't actually new in 2022. Someone had already gotten there 4 years earlier, working from a completely different dataset. That earlier work came from Peter de Barros Damgaard's team in 2018, a Nature paper built on 137 ancient genomes, backed by a companion science paper adding 74 additional whole genomes pulled specifically from Inner Asia and Anatolia. They got there independently, years before Lazaridis' team published, using their own samples and their own methods. Their finding, stated in their own words, was a lack of steppe ancestry in the Anatolian samples they tested. Not an ambiguous result, not a partial one, a documented absence. The conclusion in that 2018 paper's own summary is direct. The Indo-European Hittite language derived from Anatolia itself, not from steppe migrants riding in from elsewhere. What makes this worth pausing on is the structure of the agreement. Two separate ancient DNA teams, working with different sample sets in different labs years apart, landed on the same negative result. A negative finding, an absence of signal, is genuinely harder to manufacture or misread than a positive one. Either the ancestry shows up in the data, or it doesn't. It didn't. And the sample size only grew in the years between them. Damgaard's 2018 work drew on 74 relevant genomes from the region. Lazaridis' 2022 study expanded that same question to 727. 4 years, 651 additional individuals, and the absence held. Two independent datasets agreeing on an absence. That's the kind of consistency that ends debates. The Northern Levant lost more than half its gene pool during the transition from the late Chalcolithic into the early Bronze Age. That's the finding from Scortanioti and her team, published in Cell in 2020. A genuine population turnover, documented in the ancient DNA itself. Anatolia and the Southern Caucasus tell a completely different story across that same stretch of time. Scortanioti's team documents genetic continuity in both regions, with only transient gene flow passing through. No large-scale replacement, no comparable disruption. That continuity has deep roots. It traces back to a Neolithic admixture cline formed between Western Anatolia and the Caucasus and Zagros region, roughly 6500 BCE, thousands of years before Hattusa existed, before Hittite was ever written down, before anyone was calling themselves Hittite at all. The dataset behind this finding is substantial. 110 ancient Near Eastern individuals, spanning the late Neolithic all the way through the late Bronze Age. That's not a narrow snapshot. That's a long, continuous transect across thousands of years of the same region. The team even modeled when that founding mixture actually happened. Using a generation length of 28 years, drawn from Morjani and colleagues' 2016 work, they placed the admixture event at 105 generations before the sampled individuals, give or take 19 generations. Run that math out, and it lands the founding population mix squarely around 6500 BCE. In plain terms, the people living in Anatolia during the Hittite era were mostly descended from populations who had already been rooted there for thousands of years before Hittite was ever spoken by anyone. So the language moved. The population, for the most part, stayed put. Independent modeling adds another layer to that picture. Using QPAD and G25 methods, researchers at Genes of the Ancients estimated in 2024 that Hittite period Central Anatolians carried around 23% Proto-Hittite, Northwest Anatolian-derived admixture, layered on top of the population that was already there. A related, earlier stage population in that same modeling comes out at roughly 80% Northwest Anatolian ancestry, with a steppe-adjacent component sitting somewhere between 10 and 20%. The pattern researchers use to describe this is an avalanche, or a snowball, mixing that happens incrementally at each stage of movement, rather than one clean, single invasion event sweeping through all at once. That framing lines up precisely with what Scortanioti's continuity data already showed: gradual layering, not replacement. The likely route sketched out by this modeling has language and a comparatively small number of people moving first from the Eastern Balkans into Northwest Anatolia. From there, it spreads further inland, mixing as it goes, eventually reaching Central Anatolia, the region where Hattusa would later rise as a capital. This is a genuinely different mechanism from the one the textbook myth depends on. It looks far less like conquest and far more like language spreading through elite networks, trade routes, and generations of small-scale mixing, which is a very different picture than horses and chariots pouring over a border. Here's where the story gets complicated in a completely different direction. A 2025 reevaluation paper makes a striking claim. Almost all of the ancient DNA samples labeled Hittite in the major published studies, the work from Lazaridis, from Scortanioti, from Damgard, actually come from pre-Hittite Hattian contexts, or from non-Indo-European Hurrian burial contexts instead. The sites named in that paper are specific: Alakahoyuk, Ikiztepe, Titrish-Hoyuk, Ova-Ören. Even Hattusa itself, the Hittite capital, shows up on that list. The reason comes down to burial practice. Hittite elite funerary custom was cremation. Hittite commoners and children, meanwhile, were typically buried in pithoi, large clay storage jars pressed into service as coffins. Both of those practices are terrible for DNA preservation compared to simple pit or stone burials. Cremated bone loses most of its genetic material to fire. Pithos burials fare little better over the centuries, so geneticists sampling Bronze Age Anatolia have largely been working from the graves that happen to survive well, not necessarily the graves that belong to actual Hittites. There's concrete evidence for the cremation practice itself. The Osman Kayası Cemetery, near Hattusa, holds roughly 50 cremation urns dated between 1600 and 1200 BCE, several still containing grave goods placed alongside the ashes. The population that geneticists have been calling Hittite for the better part of a decade may, in large part, actually be their pre-Hittite or non-Indo-European neighbors instead. That's not a small footnote. That's a labeling problem sitting underneath every single headline that has ever claimed to reveal Hittite DNA. Pithos burials, according to the reevaluation paper, occur in only 10 to 20% of Hittite cemeteries. So even in the cemeteries where they exist, they represent a minority practice, and, for sequencing purposes, something close to a genetic dead end. One independent researcher, cited on a long-running genetics forum thread, put the underlying problem bluntly. Only a handful of Bronze Age Anatolian samples exist in total, and they're too generically Anatolian to confidently separate genuine Hittite elites from the Hattian or Hurrian populations living under Hittite rule at the same sites. The consequence is direct. Every population-level claim currently circulating about the Hittites' DNA is built on a sample that may be disproportionately non-Hittite to begin with. This doesn't undo the bigger continuity findings or the absence of steppe migration. Those conclusions come from broad regional sampling across many centuries and many sites, and they hold regardless of any single site's attribution problem. What it does mean is that specific claims about Hittite royal or elite ancestry, specifically, are far shakier than they sound once they've been compressed into a headline or an infographic. That's exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened the moment a careful academic paper turns into a shareable graphic with a bold, confident caption underneath it. Which raises an obvious question for the one place where cremation and preservation actually did align enough to leave something behind: the tombs of Alakahoyuk. North of Hattusa sits Alakahoyuk, home to a set of early Bronze Age tombs built in a distinctly royal style, burials long associated in popular accounts with early Anatolian rulers, and sometimes loosely linked in less careful retellings to Proto-Hittite elites. The 2025 reevaluation paper names Alakahoyuk specifically among the sites where the sampled burials predate, or otherwise sit outside, genuine Hittite period cultural attribution. That means a good number of the most publicized royal DNA narratives built around this site are almost certainly describing an earlier culture layer entirely, most likely Hattian, not Hittite. The Hattians were the indigenous, non-Indo-European population of central Anatolia, present in the region long before Hittite speakers arrived and gradually absorbed much of their culture, their religious practice, and their place names into the emerging Hittite state. The continuity runs deeper than geography. Hittite kings themselves retained heavily Hattian religious practices and vocabulary well into the height of the empire, centuries after the language of the ruling class had shifted to Hittite. That cultural persistence mirrors, almost exactly, the genetic continuity Scortaniotes' team documented in the bones. Put plainly, the Hittites didn't erase the people who were already there before them, genetically or culturally. They merged with them, and that merger shows up just as clearly at Steppe on the Black Sea coast. Steppe sits on Anatolia's Black Sea coast, and it has produced one of the larger single-site samples in the entire Scortaniote dataset. 11 individuals from the late Chalcolithic layer alone, according to the paper's own site-by-site breakdown. Its position matters for a specific reason. Sitting on the northern coast, far from the eastern approaches where Caucasus-linked ancestry first enters the region, Steppe functions as a useful check on how far that ancestry actually spread. It tests whether the Caucasus-linked signal seen in central Anatolia reached this far west and north, or whether it stayed confined closer to its point of entry. But Steppe carries the same complication already raised at Alakahoyuk. The 2025 reevaluation paper flags Steppe's Hittite period-labeled samples as well, arguing they likely belong to pre-Hittite layers rather than to the historical Hittite kingdom itself. Taken together, that means two of the most frequently cited Hittite DNA site names in popular science writing, Alakahoyuk and Steppe, are both flagged by the exact same critique. That doesn't erase the broader regional pattern of continuity documented across Anatolia as a whole. It simply means site-specific headlines deserve a level of scrutiny that a study-wide continuity finding doesn't need. There's a real gap between two very different kinds of claims. Anatolia as a region shows continuity, is well supported, backed by broad sampling across centuries. This specific skeleton was a Hittite is a claim the same evidence often can't actually carry. Move south from the coast, into the northern Levant, and the picture flips entirely. Unlike central Anatolia, the northern Levant saw more than half its gene pool replaced during the transition from the late Chalcolithic into the early Bronze Age, a finding Scortaniotes' team laid out clearly in their 2020 paper. The team traced that replacement to new gene flow entering the region, carrying ancestry related to the Zagros and Caucasus, alongside ancestry linked to the southern Levant. This wasn't a subtle shift, it was a substantial reworking of who was living there. One individual stands out even within that already disrupted picture. A person from the late Bronze Age northern Levant sample turned out to be genetically distinct from everyone else around them, very likely a long-distance traveler originally from Central Asia, based on later analysis of the same dataset. Two sites dominate this part of the sample set: Alalakh, where 26 individuals were analyzed, and Ebla, where 12 were analyzed, both located in the northern Levant. This contrast carries real weight for the Hittite story specifically, because the Hittite Empire, at the height of its power, directly controlled or actively contested both Alalakh and the territory surrounding Ebla. So the empire's core, up in Anatolia, shows the quiet continuity already laid out. Its southern frontier, down in the Levant, was undergoing genuine, large-scale population turnover during roughly that same broad era. That's an empire built over two very different demographic foundations. Genetic proximity comparisons drawn from data adjacent to the Reich lab place modern Turkish populations among the more genetically distant modern groups relative to the sampled Bronze Age genomes labeled Hittite period. That distance isn't mysterious once you account for the roughly 3,000 years sitting between then and now. Phrygian settlement, Galatian arrivals, Roman administration, Byzantine rule, and above all the medieval Turkic migrations all moved through Anatolia in the centuries since, reshaping the region's language and, over time, a real portion of its gene pool. A parallel process shows up further north, documented in the same 2018 Damgard paper's broader steppe dataset. Across the Eurasian steppe, populations that were once Indo-European speaking and West Eurasian in ancestry were gradually transformed into mostly Turkic-speaking groups of primarily East Asian ancestry. That steppe transformation is its own separate historical event, unconnected to the Hittite question directly, but it explains something important. Modern Turkey and ancient Hittite Anatolia are not simple stand-ins for one another genetically, even though both occupy exactly the same land. This is one of the most common points of confusion sitting in the comments section under almost any DNA-focused video. Geography staying fixed in place does not mean ancestry stays fixed along with it. Language, land, and ancestry are three separate threads, and nothing requires them to move together. The Hittite case is proof of that in one direction, language arriving without a matching population shift. The later Turkic migrations are proof of it in the other direction entirely, population and language both shifting substantially on the very same ground, which is exactly the trap the next generation of Hittite headlines keeps falling into. Popular science coverage of these papers routinely compresses "no steppe migration detected" at a regional and continental scale into something punchier and considerably less accurate. Scientists prove where the Hittites came from. The actual papers are far more careful than that framing suggests. Lazaridis and his team describe negligible impact from steppe migration, not zero ancestry. Scortanioti's team describes continuity with only transient gene flow, not total isolation from the outside world. These are precise, hedged scientific statements, and precision doesn't survive translation into a headline. None of the three major studies driving this whole conversation, Damgard in 2018, Scortanioti in 2020, Lazaridis in 2022, claim to have identified a Hittite royal genome, a Hittite elite lineage, or anything resembling a single defined Hittite genetic signature. The 2025 re-evaluation paper exists specifically because the gap between what these papers carefully say and what headlines confidently claim had widened enough to need correcting out loud. This is a recurring pattern across ancient DNA journalism more broadly, not unique to this topic. Regional population, the Southern Arc Project's own authors are careful to note that further sampling will still be needed to narrow down the precise homeland location within the broader Caucasus and West Asia highland zone. This isn't a closed case, it's an ongoing one, with the current picture representing the best available reading of an incomplete dataset. No ancient genome yet exists that can be confidently and specifically attributed to a named historical Hittite king, a royal family member, or any documented figure pulled from the cuneiform record. Every genome sequence so far represents an anonymous individual from a burial context, not a verified historical person. The Pithos burial preservation problem raised by the 2025 re-evaluation paper hasn't been solved. It remains an open sampling gap, one that will require future excavation and improved laboratory technique to close, if it closes at all. A comparable pattern shows up well beyond Anatolia. Follow-up work building on the Damgard and Narasimhan datasets, looking at Iron Age populations in Uzbekistan, found that Anatolian and Iranian farmer-related ancestry still made up between 64 and 70% of local ancestry, even after major steppe-related migrations had already passed through the region. That's a useful reminder stretching across the entire macro region, not just Anatolia. Migration happening and population getting replaced are two entirely different claims, and confusing them is where most of these headlines go wrong. This matters because it shows the Hittite case isn't some special exception carved out of the broader pattern. It's part of a much wider trend across ancient West and Central Asia, where language and culture consistently moved faster and further than genomes actually did. There is one real test still waiting to happen. Future ancient DNA recovery, specifically targeting confirmed elite Hittite cremation contexts, could finally determine whether Hittite royalty differed genetically at all from the general Central Anatolian population, if preservation technique ever catches up to the ambition of the question. None of that changes what the last decade of sequencing has already ruled out. Ruled out, across 3 independent major studies, is a Yamnaya-style steppe invasion, bringing Hittite speakers into Anatolia by force or by mass migration. That version of events simply doesn't survive contact with the data. Ruled out as well is any detectable large-scale steppe ancestry signal in Bronze Age Central Anatolian populations at all. The absence held across multiple independent datasets, built years apart by different teams. Supported instead is deep local genetic continuity in Anatolia, reaching back to a roughly 6500 BCE admixture cline, with the Hittite language arriving on top of a population that was already there. Supported instead is a shared, older Caucasus highland-related ancestry source connecting Hittite-era Anatolians to the Yamnaya out on the steppe, cousins descended from one root population, not conqueror and conquered. One separate, ongoing problem has been flagged alongside all of that. Most DNA samples labeled Hittite in both the literature and the media likely belong to pre-Hittite Hattitian contexts, or to non-Indo-European Hurrian burial contexts instead, a direct consequence of Hittite cremation and pithos practices resisting DNA preservation in the archaeological record. The textbook chariot invasion image doesn't survive any of the 3 major datasets built to test it, but the confident modern claim that scientists have sequenced the Hittites as a clearly defined genetic group doesn't survive scrutiny either. Both of those corrections point toward the same uncomfortable lesson about certainty in this field. A regional population history claim, something like, Anatolia shows continuity, not replacement, can be extremely well supported by 727 sequenced individuals spanning 10,000 years. That's about as solid a foundation as ancient DNA research gets. A specific ethnic or dynastic claim, something like, this genome belonged to a Hittite, can remain almost entirely unsupported, even sitting inside that exact same well-funded, well-published dataset. The gap between those two kinds of claims is where nearly every misleading ancient DNA headline actually lives, not just for the Hittites. The same gap shows up in coverage of Vikings, of Celts, and of plenty of other named historical peoples covered elsewhere. The 2025 reevaluation paper offers a useful model for how this kind of gap gets corrected properly, not by attacking the underlying sequencing work itself, which remains sound, but by checking whether the burial context labels attached to each sample actually match the historical culture being claimed for it. There's something close to a paradox sitting at the center of this whole topic. The Hittites are among the most thoroughly documented civilizations of the Bronze Age in their own writing. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, named kings, treaties, law codes. And yet their genetic identity remains one of the least resolved questions in all of Bronze Age archaeogenetics. That paradox is likely to persist until preservation techniques improve enough to recover usable DNA from cremated remains and from pithos burials specifically, which leaves one real question hanging over the whole field, not just this topic. If a civilization this well documented in its own writing can still have its DNA almost entirely unaccounted for, that says something uncomfortable about the population claims routinely made for cultures that left no writing behind at all. Every DNA reveals the true origin of a lost people headline is built on a sampling foundation that is rarely as complete as the framing around it suggests. The papers themselves tend to know this. The headlines built on top of them usually don't. The Hittite case shows both failure modes happening at once, side by side. On one hand, a genuinely overturned invasion myth, a well-supported, legitimate correction, backed by 3 independent datasets. On the other, an unearned certainty about whose bones were even being tested in the first place, a labeling problem that's still actively being worked out in the literature. Both of those are normal, healthy parts of how science actually progresses. Corrections stacked on corrections, each one narrowing the picture a little further. They just rarely survive contact with a punchy headline written to get clicks instead of to be precise. So the next time a video declares that DNA has finally revealed who a lost civilization really was, the honest follow-up question is simple. Whose bones exactly did they test? That question doesn't have a tidy answer yet, and that's worth sitting with. The Hittites left behind one of the richest written records of the entire Bronze Age world. Treaties with Egypt, law codes, royal annals, a defined capital at Hattusa still standing in the ground today. Their genetic record, by contrast, remains genuinely thin, likely underrepresented by the very preservation quirks of their own funerary customs, the cremations and pithos burials that resisted the survival of usable DNA for thousands of years. Here's what the sequencing has actually settled. No steppe invasion. Deep local continuity, stretching back thousands of years before Hittite was ever spoken. A shared ancient route linking Anatolia to populations far to the north. out on the steppe itself. Here's what it hasn't settled: whose specific bones future researchers will need to find, whether inside a Hattusa cremation urn or a Hittite period pithos, to finally put a name and a face to the empire's own genetic story. Until that happens, Hittite DNA stays an open case file. Not a myth confirmed, not a myth entirely busted, just an honest gap in the record, waiting on the next excavation and the next improvement in laboratory technique. That gap is where the next study in this field will have to start.